A woman is sitting at a dining table, surrounded by her family. Everyone is talking, laughing, sharing stories from their day. She smiles at the right moments, asks the right questions, but inside she carries a weight she cannot name. When they try to ask her how she is, the words simply do not exist. "I'm fine," she replies, knowing she is lying. Not out of malice, but because the truth lives in a territory where language cannot reach. There is a peculiar loneliness that inhabits this space. It is not the loneliness of someone who is physically alone, but something more cruel. The loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people and yet remains fundamentally misunderstood. It is the silent anguish of carrying experiences that seem untranslatable, feelings that die in the throat before they even become words. This is the most subtle and devastating pain of the modern human condition. The awareness that our inner life is a private territory, inaccessible to others, no matter how hard we try to build bridges with language. It is discovering that there are aspects of ourselves that will remain forever lonely, not by choice, but by structural impossibility. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein spent his entire life obsessed with this boundary. He knew that there is something deeply disturbing about the discovery that language, our most sophisticated tool for human connection, has insurmountable limits, and that these limits are not technical flaws that we can fix, but fundamental characteristics of human experience. But perhaps there is hidden wisdom in this impossibility. Perhaps accepting our partial incommunicability is not resignation, but the first step toward a more authentic way of existing in the world. Imagine that your entire life someone has tried to convince you that the red you see is identical to the red others see. Seems obvious, right? But Wittgenstein asked a devastating question. How could you prove it? How could you be sure that the subjective experience of red in someone else's mind is the same as yours? The answer is simple and terrifying. You can't. You never can. Because subjective experience is by definition private. This isn't just an abstract philosophical exercise. It's the concrete reality of anyone who has ever tried to explain to someone else what they really feel when they are anxious, depressed, in love, or lost. The words exist: anxiety, sadness, love, confusion. But they are just empty labels floating on oceans of experience that remain untouched by language. Wittgenstein called this language games. Not because language is a game, but because it functions like a game with specific rules. And one of the cruelest rules is that certain aspects of human experience simply cannot be played. They exist outside the board. Think about the last time someone asked you how you were doing during a difficult time. You probably responded with something like, "It's complicated," or "It's been tough." But internally you knew that those words were pale shadows of the real complexity of what you were going through. Language didn't fail because you couldn't find the right words. It failed because some human experiences are structurally inexpressible. There is a particular melancholy in this discovery. It is realizing that we carry entire worlds within us that can never be fully shared. That our deepest intimacy is, paradoxically, our most absolute loneliness. But there is something even more disturbing here. Wittgenstein realized that our own relationship with our feelings is also mediated by language. In other words, even to ourselves, we often cannot fully understand what we are feeling. Language not only fails to communicate our experience to others, it also fails to make our experience clear to ourselves. That is why we sometimes wake up with an indefinable sense of unease, or spend days carrying around an anguish we cannot name. It is not a lack of emotional intelligence. It is just that some aspects of our inner life exist in a pre-linguistic region where words have not yet arrived, and may never arrive. Imagine an infinite library where some books are written in a language you will never learn. These books contain essential stories about who you are, but they will remain closed forever. This is the human condition according to Wittgenstein. We are librarians of our own experience, but with limited access to the most important volumes. Modern society has made this prison even more painful. We live in an age that promises total communication, social media, therapy, self-help, constant connection. But the more communication tools we have, the more aware we become of our fundamental incommunicability. It's like having increasingly powerful telescopes that only serve to reveal the immensity of space we will never explore. This contradiction creates a specific anxiety. The feeling that we should be able to explain what we feel, that the inability to do so is a personal failure. When someone says, "I understand exactly how you feel," a part of us is relieved, but a deeper part whispers, "No, you don't." And that second voice is right. But perhaps the tragedy lies not in incommunicability itself, but in our resistance to it. Wittgenstein intuited that there is a hidden liberation in accepting the limits of language, not as resignation, but as recognition of a particular dignity of human experience. Some aspects of who we are so unique, so singular, that they resist any attempt at translation. The question is not how to overcome these limits. The question is what happens when we stop fighting them and begin to inhabit them with a strange form of pride. Because perhaps our incommunicability is not a flaw. Perhaps it is exactly what makes us human. There is a specific moment in adulthood when we discover that our parents also carry pain they have never been able to express. Perhaps it is during a casual conversation when a distant look reveals decades of accumulated silence, or when we realize that the constant irritation of our childhood was actually a desperate way of communicating something that had no name. Wittgenstein grew up in a family where the unsaid reigned supreme. 3 of his brothers committed suicide. A tragedy of this magnitude should have led to deep conversations, long hugs, desperate attempts at mutual understanding. But what happened was the opposite. A deafening silence that hung in the hallways of the house like a toxic fog. It is this fog that permeates modern society. We walk the streets carrying untold stories, unnamed wounds, fears that have never found the right words. And the more time passes, the heavier this invisible burden becomes. Because what is left unsaid does not disappear, it festers. The cruelty of emotional incommunicability lies not only in the impossibility of being understood by others. It lies in the way this impossibility turns into a kind of self-censorship. We begin to believe that if we cannot explain something, perhaps it is not valid. If we cannot find words for our anguish, perhaps we are exaggerating. If our pain cannot be expressed in coherent sentences, perhaps it does not deserve attention. This is the most subtle trap of language. It not only fails to express our experience, it makes us doubt the very validity of that experience. Wittgenstein called this language enchantment. We come to believe that only what can be clearly said exists. The rest becomes noise, neurosis, unnecessary drama. But what if the opposite were true? What if the very things we cannot say are the most important things about us? What if our inability to translate certain experiences into words is not a limitation, but a sign that these experiences are too profound for ordinary language? Think about the last time someone close to you tried to minimize your pain with phrases like "it'll pass" or "it's not that bad." The intention may have been good, but the effect was devastating. Because these phrases carry an implicit message. If you can't explain what you're feeling properly, it's probably not as serious as you think. If you've ever experienced this, if you've ever felt your words die before you could express what was really going on inside, then you know exactly what we're talking about. There is a silent violence in emotional invalidation. A form of erasure that happens not through direct denial, but through the impossible demand for absolute clarity. Wittgenstein realized that we live in a culture obsessed with explanation. Everything has to make sense, have an identifiable cause, a clear solution. But some human experiences are inherently mysterious. Not because they are irrational, but because they transcend the categories available in our everyday language. Anxiety, for example. Everyone knows the word. But how many people can really explain the experience of waking up at 3 in the morning with your heart racing because of a fear with no specific object? Depression. We talk about it constantly. But how can we translate into words the feeling of carrying an invisible stone that makes every movement a Herculean effort? The paradox intensifies when we realize that the more we try to explain these states, the more inadequate the words become. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The effort itself guarantees failure. And then we begin to blame ourselves for the inadequacy of words, as if it were our responsibility to invent a language that does not yet exist. But perhaps this guilt is unnecessary. Perhaps our inability to explain certain experiences is not a personal failure, but a structural feature of the human condition. Perhaps there are aspects of our inner life that are, by their very nature, incommunicable. And perhaps this is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. Wittgenstein intuited that there is a particular dignity in the unsaid, a form of poetic resistance against the tyranny of total explanation. Some aspects of who we are deserve to remain silent, not because they are less important, but because they are too important for ordinary language. A child draws a house, and when she finishes, she looks at the paper with a mixture of pride and frustration. The drawing does not exactly capture what she saw in her mind. The colors are different, the proportions are wrong. Something essential was lost in the translation from imagination to paper. But she does not throw the drawing away. She hangs it on the refrigerator, knowing that it is both inadequate and precious. This is the human condition when faced with emotional language. We are all children trying to draw houses that exist only in internal territories inaccessible to others. And like that child, we must learn to live with the fundamental inadequacy of our expression, without giving up the impulse to create, to try, to communicate the uncommunicable. Wittgenstein spent decades of his life trying to map exactly where language worked and where it failed. Not out of intellectual masochism, but because he sensed that there was a hidden liberation in this mapping. If we can accurately identify the limits of language, perhaps we can stop torturing ourselves for not being able to transcend them. he discovered something revolutionary. Language does not fail by accident. It fails by design. Some human experiences are structurally private, not because our communication technology has not yet evolved enough, but because the very nature of these experiences resists translation. This changes everything. It means that when you cannot explain to someone how you really feel, it is not because you lack emotional intelligence, nor because the other person lacks empathy. It's because you're trying to do something that is by definition impossible. There is a strange melancholy in this discovery, but also an unexpected liberation. It's like discovering that you've been trying to run a marathon with broken legs. The realization of impossibility removes the guilt of failure. But Wittgenstein went further. He realized that our obsession with overcoming the limits of language was preventing us from adequately inhabiting the territory that language can reach. It was as if we were so frustrated by our inability to fly that we forgot to learn how to walk properly. Think about the most meaningful conversations you've ever had. They probably weren't the ones where everything was explained with crystal clarity. They were the ones where something important was communicated through silences, glances, gestures, pauses. A whole parallel language that works precisely in the spaces where words fail. There is a particular intimacy in these moments of imperfect communication. When someone tries to explain something painful and you realize that words are not enough, but you still manage to grasp something essential through the gaps, the stumbles, the very inadequacy of language. It is as if the failure to communicate paradoxically becomes a deeper form of connection. Wittgenstein called this showing rather than telling. Some truths about human experience cannot be stated directly, but can be shown through the very attempt to say them. Emotional stuttering, awkward silences, inadequate metaphors. All of these communicate something that perfect language could never convey. But our modern culture has a deep intolerance for incompleteness. We want definitive answers, efficient communication, problems solved. The idea that some fundamental aspects of human experience are inherently mysterious makes us deeply uncomfortable. Perhaps that is why so many people feel inadequate when they cannot explain their feelings with academic precision. We have internalized the belief that communicative clarity is synonymous with mental health, when in fact it may be exactly the opposite. The most profound experiences of life, love, loss, transcendence, despair, are precisely those that resist clear explanation. Wittgenstein proposed a radically different way of relating to this limitation. Instead of fighting against incommunicability, he suggested that we learn to inhabit it with dignity, not as resignation, but as recognition that some aspects of our humanity are too precious to be reduced to common language. There is a particular courage in accepting that we will never be completely understood. It is the courage to keep trying to communicate, knowing that communication will always be incomplete. It is the courage to remain vulnerable in front of others, even knowing that something essential will always be lost in translation. An elderly man sits in a square and watches people pass by. Each face carries stories he will never know, pains that will remain forever inaccessible, joys that exist only in the intimacy of private experiences. He no longer feels the old anguish of not being able to penetrate these closed worlds. On the contrary, there is a strange peace in recognizing that each person around him is a complete and fundamentally unknowable universe. This was Wittgenstein's final discovery, that accepting the limits of language does not have to be a defeat. It can be a form of wisdom. When we stop fighting against the inherent incommunicability of the human condition, something unexpected happens. We begin to value differently the moments of partial connection we are able to achieve. Wittgenstein spent the last years of his life in almost monastic seclusion, not out of misanthropy, but because he understood something that most of us still don't, that our existential loneliness is not a problem to be solved, but a feature to be inhabited with dignity. He had found a peculiar form of peace, not the peace of someone who had managed to communicate everything, but the peace of someone who had accepted that not everything needs to be communicated. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This is perhaps Wittgenstein's most famous phrase, but also the most misunderstood. Most people read it as resignation, as an admission of defeat in the face of the limits of language. But there is another way to understand it, as an invitation to reverence in the face of mystery. Some human experiences deserve to remain silent, not because they are less important, but because they are too important. Silence, in this perspective, is not the absence of communication. It is a deeper form of communication. It is the recognition that there are truths that can only be honored through the impossibility of expressing them adequately. Think about the people closest to you. The most intimate conversations you share are rarely those where everything is explained clearly. They are those where you can sit together in comfortable silence, where a glance communicates more than 1,000 words, where the very attempt to explain something painful becomes a form of intimacy deeper than any perfect explanation could achieve. There is a melancholic beauty in this form of connection. It's like two people trying to draw the same landscape. The drawings will never be identical, but the act of drawing together creates a closeness that transcends the accuracy of the representation. It doesn't matter that the drawings are different. What matters is that you were looking at the same landscape. Wittgenstein discovered that our obsession with being completely understood was preventing us from appreciating the imperfect forms of understanding we already have. It was as if we were so frustrated by our inability to telepathically and fully convey our inner experience that we forgot to be grateful for the moments when someone manages to grasp even partially something of what we are trying to communicate. The truth is that we will never be completely understood, and perhaps that is a blessing in disguise. Because if we were totally transparent to each other, if our inner lives were completely accessible, we would lose something essential about what it means to be human. We would lose the mystery that makes every genuine encounter a discovery. Have you ever noticed how the most interesting people are precisely those who keep something inaccessible? Not out of calculation or manipulation, but because they carry within themselves experiences that simply cannot be put into words. There is a particular depth in those who have learned to live with their own inner mysteries without feeling the desperate need to explain them at every turn. This is the ultimate wisdom Wittgenstein offers, learning to love our own communicative incompleteness, learning to find peace in the fact that we are, each of us, partially unknowable, even to ourselves, and that this unknowability is not a flaw in the human design, but perhaps its most beautiful feature. When we accept that some aspects of our experience will forever remain private, we paradoxically become more capable of real intimacy, because we stop demanding impossible total understanding from others and begin to value the partial gestures of understanding we are able to offer and receive. In the end, perhaps the greatest courage is not to try to explain everything about ourselves, but to continue offering ourselves to the world, knowing that something essential will always remain unexpressed. It is the courage to love and be loved through the imperfect language we have, rather than waiting for the perfect language we will never have. There is an irreducible loneliness in the human condition, but there is also a silent solidarity. We all carry experiences that we will never be able to communicate completely. And perhaps that is exactly what unites us more deeply than any explanation ever could. What about you? Have you ever felt the loneliness of someone who carries something they cannot explain? Write in the comments. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos. You reflect on each idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to go with this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the codes of the White Rabbit are ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.